Barbara Sarah, you're at the Listening Post. This week, the media battle in Syria and President Assad's PR counteroffensive. The world of news and journalism through computer games.
No, stop, I'm a journalist.
Another Egyptian blogger is caught in the crosshairs of the country's military government. And watch out, the pixels are taking over the city. It's been 7 months since anti-government protests began in Syria, and with the fall of each Arab regime, the political heat on the Bashar al-Assad government has intensified. Now, reporting on the story has been near impossible. Foreign journalists have only had access when Damascus has allowed it, and local media has been silenced. What coverage there is pieced together from grainy cell phone video and scattered bits of information from activists across the country. But this week, after months of media lockdown, President Assad gave 3 interviews to foreign media in less than 48 hours. It was a strategy designed to deliver Assad's message loud and clear. Intervention in Syria will come at a high price. Well, that's our starting point this week. The message from Damascus that was aimed at the Western world, the Arab League, and Syrian protesters on the ground.
The situation in Syria really is all about 2 narratives.
One by the revolutionary side, which is that what's happening in Syria is a peaceful protest movement to achieve democracy.
The regime's narrative is one of impending civil war, armed violent attacks by Islamists.
Any conflict is complex, and reporting is very difficult. But in Syria, it's made even more difficult by the fact that there's very limited access.
With most foreign correspondents remaining under tight control, it's hard to get balanced reports.
The media blockade of Syria has been the Assad government's most successful tactic in the battle to control the narrative. Watching leaders in the region topple one after another, it's become clear to those still standing that keeping the media out of the country is crucial to keeping themselves in power.
You know, they've seen what the independent media in Libya did, despite all the attempts to restrict their movements. As long as you have journalists on the ground operating, they will tell the story, and that's something which the regime doesn't want to happen.
I think the media blackout has been successful in ensuring that the quality and verifiability of information that comes out of the country is very poor.
Jazeera cannot independently verify the footage.
We're relying basically on citizen journalists who are risking their lives to bring us reports of the regime's repression, but these reach us unverified and without context. So it's very difficult to disentangle fact from fiction.
And for both the Syrian government and the protesting opposition, how they handle the facts on the ground and the fiction that gets spun has been crucial. Late in September, the gory death of a Syrian girl, Zainab al-Husni, hit the headlines. The mangled body was evidence of extensive torture by Syrian forces, and there was global outcry. But a week after the story broke, it was debunked by the Syrian government.
When the story gained a lot of traction, the regime then wheeled out the real Zainab, and they said, well, here you go. The international media is lying. Human rights organizations cannot be trusted because this is the real Zainab and this is her real ID card. And this other girl, well, who knows who she is?
Now, there was a body. Somebody was definitely killed and tortured and beheaded. We don't know who that was, but we know it wasn't this girl who was made a big cause. These sorts of mistakes and hysterical and exaggerated reporting has done a disservice to the opposition and has reduced their credibility.
The whole point of this entire exercise is for the Syrian government to illustrate that, in fact, the opposition and the demonstrators and their supporters locally and internationally cannot be trusted.
Within Syria, the media balance tilts in Assad's favor. Opposition-run news outlets are virtually non-existent, and the government holds sway over television broadcasters.
We have the state media. You also have Dunya Television, The World, which is a privately owned station, but one very close to the regime. And they have been reiterating a message of attack from foreign elements who are controlled by Islamists and Salafis.
So they've been very successful at frightening at least half the population into supporting the government and fearing the opposition, that they're extremists. So if they take over, it's going to be a Muslim Brotherhood kind of Islamic law governed state. This is the thrust of their narrative. And of course, they also broadcast friendly, non-confrontational interviews with the president, where he gets kind of softball questions rather than being forced to answer some of the more harsh accusations against him.
Late last month, Assad sat down with 3 hand-picked international news outlets, speaking to a global media audience for the first time in nearly 7 months.
Bashar al-Assad wants to send a very, very strong message to the West that if they decide to get involved in Syria, then there will be huge ramifications for the entire region. Basically, he wants to scare the West. If you think Afghanistan was bad, Syria will be a lot worse.
I think it's a message both to the outside world and to Syrians themselves. And I think he's very much playing on the very real fears that Syrians have of an impending civil war.
That would make an already dire security situation much worse. And in the larger media battle, protesters are concerned that the notion of civil war could hugely damage the public image they've built.
The people on the streets of Syria are doing everything they can to get the story out the way they perceive it, which is essentially them demonstrating peacefully and the government cracking down. The government, on the other hand, cannot live with that narrative. And that's really the reason why it aggressively pursues journalists, bloggers, and regular citizens who are involved in the production and creation of this narrative.
It suits the protesters to frame these revolutions purely as being for democracy, human rights, freedom. But I think there's always an underlying political reality. Being someone who is very much part of the revolutionary side, I have to be very careful about what I say in public in case they are, what I say is misunderstood or could perhaps benefit the regime in one way or another. For example, if I was to tell you that in Syria now there is a low-level civil war or low-intensity civil war, I'm sure there will be many people, even within the revolutionary camp, who will say, you're serving the regime's narrative. Well, that's my opinion. As a journalist, that's what I think is actually happening on the ground. But it doesn't suit the protesters. They want to see it simply as a Tunisia or Egypt-style revolution, and there is no civil war happening.
The real story is much more nuanced than either side is willing to let on. But as long as journalists remain locked out, orchestrated interviews and amateur video will be the only information we get to understand the story of Syria.
Our Global Village voices now on the battle of narratives in Syria.
The Syrian regime's media strategy has evolved considerably. Initially, the regime's strategy was based on suppressing information. It also blamed the protests on local armed thugs, radical Islamists, and foreign conspirators. In the last few weeks, the regime has adopted a different strategy, one that is at least meant to be seen as more conciliatory. It has done so by admitting that mistakes were made in the initial months and pledging that the path of reform has been taken and that there is no going back from reform.
The Assad effort, I think, was actually relatively limited, if it had any effect at all. And indeed, it may have actually shown that the president is acting from increasing concern and even fear at what's happening inside his country.
What's also interesting is that at the same time that he gave this interview to the Sunday Telegraph, he also gave an interview to Russian television. What he was doing with the Russians was almost thanking them for their support, for vetoing the UN resolutions, and for encouraging them to stay on his side and to avoid the same fate that the West had done in siding away from him.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Let's start in Egypt, where the military government and the country's media have been battling each other, and their latest feud is with a prominent blogger, Alaa Abdel Fattah. Military authorities detained the online activist for 15 days after he refused to submit to an interrogation following violent clashes in Cairo last month. Abdel Fattah has been outspoken about the army's involvement in the violence during the protests. He even wrote an article in Egypt's Al-Shuruq newspaper with details of a protester's death. Soon after the article was published, Abdel Fattah was called in for questioning by the military prosecutor. He refused to cooperate and demanded a civilian trial, saying the army was implicated in the violence in October and it would be absurd for them to question him. Thousands of people gathered in Cairo to protest the detention and called for the military council to step down. Now, since May, at least one blogger has been jailed and 2 have been detained for speaking out against Egypt's military regime. WikiLeaks frontman Julian Assange's legal problems just got a lot more complicated. A judgment by the UK High Court dismissed Assange's appeal against extradition to Sweden, where he is to be tried on charges of rape and sexual assault. The charges were filed last year by 2 women who said they had met Assange during his visit to Stockholm in August. The WikiLeaks founder has always maintained his innocence, claiming that the charges are part of a smear campaign.
We will be considering our next step in the days ahead.
Assange's lawyers have said they will take the appeal to the Supreme Court. To do that, however, they'll have to convince High Court judges that the verdict goes beyond Julian Assange, the individual, and raises issues of general public importance. If their case is dismissed, Assange could be sent to Sweden within 10 days. This news comes just a week after an announcement by Assange that WikiLeaks was temporarily suspending publishing due to a lack of funds. Israeli whistleblower Anat Kam, whose story we've been following here at the Listening Post, has been sentenced to 4.5 years in jail. Kam is an online journalist and was found guilty of copying thousands of classified military documents and leaking them to Uri Blau, a reporter with the Tel Aviv-based Haaretz newspaper. Blau's article, published in 2008, quoted from the secret documents and reported that Israeli forces in the West Bank assassinated Palestinian militants, allegedly in violation of Israel's own laws. Now, an investigation by the army into the story's sources blew Kam's cover, and her sentencing comes after more than a year of house arrest. Paris-based press freedom group Reporters Without Borders condemned the decision. The group said, "This severe sentence violates the right to the confidentiality of sources and sets a dangerous precedent that could encourage reporters to censor themselves." A Nigerian Islamist group known as Boko Haram has claimed responsibility for the murder of a journalist working for state-run TV. Gunmen killed Halaji Zakaria Isa, a reporter working for the Nigerian Television Authority in the far east of the country last month. A spokesman for Boko Haram said Isa was killed because he was an informant for Nigerian security agencies and had been instrumental in the arrest of some of the group's members. Now, that allegation has been disputed by both Isa's colleagues and the intelligence services. In a statement, Boko Haram said, "We have no grudge against journalists that are working in line with the professional provisions of their work. Whenever they misquote or misrepresent our position, we normally call them and tell them to correct the error. We will not hesitate to kill anybody who steps on our toes." Bureau manager for NTA in the Northeast said this isn't the first time journalists have been targeted by Boko Haram. 3 reporters recently fled the region after receiving threatening text messages. Think of video games, and what comes to mind are probably war games, not war correspondence. Pirates plundering on the high seas, not entering complex hostage swap negotiations. But there is a new genre of video games that's emerging, and it's merging the worlds of journalism and game playing. News outlets looking for an innovative way to present complex ideas or news stories are finding that video games are not just a fresh and engaging approach, but with their immersive power and capacity for detail, they're an effective medium for stories that don't quite fit into the traditional 2-minute video package. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on a new kind of video game that puts players on the front lines of news stories.
Video games are a modern-day phenomenon. For the past 2 years, they've been outperforming Hollywood in terms of revenue generated. This year, the video gaming industry is projected to rake in $74 billion. That's more than the GDPs of Bahrain, Costa Rica, and Cameroon combined.
Video games are a fantastic medium. Television gives you sound and pictures, but a video game lets you be a player in the story as well. It's really immersive. You've got the same pictures, the sounds that you'd have with TV, but you actually get to be a player in the story that you get involved in.
With a straight documentary or a piece of print, it's very linear. You're just reading. It's quite didactic. You're just hearing what someone else is saying. With a game, you're getting immersed into the actual experience, and then you can actually, you can actually affect how the story unfolds. You get much closer to the actual subject.
Broadcasters say news games are a new way to get their audiences involved in current events. Channel 4 is a British broadcaster, and it commissioned an interactive factual game called Sweatshop, and this is how it works. The player is in charge of a team of underpaid workers in an offshore clothing sweatshop, struggling to meet the demands of consumers. Now, he or she has a budget which needs to be balanced between the needs of the clients and the welfare of the workers. Moving up through 30 levels of gameplay, the player is faced with moral dilemmas, like whether to give the workers a break to get some water, or to keep them working to maximize productivity.
The game, by putting the player in a situation where they have to make those choices, implicates them in that process, makes them understand the rationale by which the sweatshop manager might make some of these management decisions. In that respect, it gives you, again, a sense of what it's like to be in someone else's shoes.
Sweatshop went viral after its launch on the internet earlier this year, racking up more than 500,000 players. The main target of the game are 14 to 19-year-olds, teenagers, who might not otherwise engage with serious mainstream media coverage about sweatshops.
The last thing they want to do is to sit down and read quite a worthy piece or an article. You know, they're more likely to be chatting to their friends, playing games, talking on their mobiles. The idea was to tackle an issue through a fun and familiar format.
Wired is a leading American technology magazine. In 2009, it published an article about Somali piracy, but alongside that traditional print piece, it created a game that took users to the Gulf of Aden, put them on a pirate ship, and into a virtual world of piracy.
The game asks you to set out on a mission, and you have to try to capture a vessel, and then if you're able to, you can take hostages and negotiate for ransom and release. Takes this subject that has been represented in the media as a political one.
Hijacking of a ship with an American crew was a way to make a political point.
It's a kind of anarchistic revenge act against the West by Somali pirates, and tries to show how there's a logic to piracy, an economic logic. It has editorial aspects in that it's trying to recast the debate about piracy from one about politics to one about economics.
Already, the Somali foreign minister is calling on the pirates to give up, saying they're in a fight they're destined to lose.
The documentary is the director's or the producer's view on a particular subject, exploring that and presenting it in a linear form. With the game, you're creating an environment or a system that explores a particular subject and puts the player in control of what they're exploring. So it becomes a much more interactive, much more immersive experience.
You'll die out there! A game that rarely uses the immersive power of the medium is Warco, short for War Correspondent.
Hang on, no, stop, I'm a journalist.
It's a new type of news game that puts the player behind the camera lens. The game, still in the prototype stage, is being developed by veteran Australian foreign correspondent Tony Mignati to bring a new edge to serious video gaming.
Warco basically is a game where you go into a battle situation. Instead of carrying a gun, you carry a video camera, press record, and wherever you point the camera, you'll capture the vision. And subsequently, when you've got a quiet moment in the game, as you do in real life combat journalism, you can bring that footage back up and cut your own news story.
At sunset, the rebels struck.
The idea behind this game is to make the player a virtual journalist operating in a war zone, learning the craft of news reporting, and confronting the uncomfortable decision between getting the story and getting involved in the story.
And the Warco game challenges not only your physical capabilities in a war zone, but also your moral and ethical positions on key issues. For instance, a journalist is always faced with the problem of do I film the action or do I put my camera down and help people who are perhaps dying?
I'm sorry, I can't help you.
My darling little girl.
Those sort of issues will come up over and over again in a game like Warco.
Escape from Woomera, released in 2003, was the first serious documentary game to hit the market. The title refers to a controversial detention facility in South Australia, which opened in 1999 to process refugees arriving by boat.
Police were unable to prevent up to 50 detainees escaping in the confusion.
The Woomera Detention Centre was a big news story, But reporting on conditions there was a challenge. Journalists weren't allowed inside the detention center, so it was difficult to get information out.
Please help us!
Refugees were communicating with people on the outside by putting notes in tennis balls and throwing them over the fence. There were very many suicide attempts from very young children through to adults, so awful things were happening inside. I spoke to as many people as I could who had been or were in the detention centre as a detainee. I approached it the same way that I would any other journalistic process.
By taking players inside the detention centre and allowing them to be virtual refugees trying to find a way out, Escape from Woomera was politically controversial, but it also proved a documentary game could find its own unique place in a big news story. So will we see more games like these coming out on the market, as traditional media outlets struggle with the reality of dwindling resources and diminishing circulation?
One of the things that journalism hasn't yet done is really taken advantage of the computer. We've taken all the old forms of journalism and distributed them in the internet, but not really invented a new way of doing news with the computer.
Games continue to be incredibly popular. They continue to dominate people's time in terms of the time they're spending online. So it's only right that it begins to kind of like spread into a more factual area. I think the future will be more games that link to news stories and journalism.
I think we're going to increasingly see a lot of issues, particularly to do with transmigration, refugees, war zones, which will lend themselves to the idea of games. And people will have to get over the idea that these are simply entertainments. They're not. I think increasingly we'll see a merger of traditional news coverage and gaming coming together. There's no doubt about that.
More Global Village voices now on the coming together of news and gaming.
News games, regardless of intent, often run the risk of trivializing a sensitive topic in the media. A more recent news game called Warco proves the genre has its merits. Players take on the role of a reporter working in an active war zone. This type of virtual experience has applications as a training tool for young journalists and shows the potential benefit a news game can provide.
For a news game to be successful at attracting new audiences, you have to incorporate the basic elements of gaming. So that means you have to surprise people, you have to challenge them, you have to reward them, and they need to have fun. And if you do that, then you'll get a new audience that you didn't have for regular news before.
Through interactivity and play, news games offer audiences a really hands-on way to experience the news rather than just reading or listening. Not only does that sometimes allow them to consume more complex pieces of information, but it can also just be more powerful and more impactful for people because they feel a sense of connection to and ownership of it.
And finally, from the cutting edge of the gaming world to a reminder of where it all began. One More Production is a visual effects company based in France, and the design geeks there have also merged video gaming with the real world, only in a slightly more abstract way. The video shows a modern-day New York being invaded by an array of blockbuster arcade games. Now, we spotted Pac-Man and Tetris. We leave the rest of the game spotting to you, and we'll see you next time, right here at The Listening Post.